Hi guys, the night air over the Nile River was still warm, even after the sun had disappeared beyond the dark western hills. A slow wind moved across the water, touching the reeds near the muddy riverbanks. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then became quiet again. Small boats rested against wooden poles driven into the soft earth. Their ropes creaked gently in the darkness. In the sleeping villages beside the river, faint oil lamps glowed behind narrow windows. Most homes were already silent. The people inside had worked since the first pale light of dawn, and their bodies were heavy with heat and labor. Sandals had been left beside doorways. Clay jars sat cooling near walls of dried mud brick. A few dying cooking fires still smelled faintly of smoke and baked grain. Above everything, the stars stretched across the Egyptian sky in endless silence. Ancient Egypt could feel peaceful at night. Quiet. Slow. But the daytime hours were filled with movement, dust, sweat, and endless chores. Long before the temples grew crowded with priests and officials, before the markets filled with shouting merchants, ordinary people were already awake inside their homes, beginning another day beside the Nile. Most Egyptians did not live in grand palaces. They lived in simple houses built from mud bricks shaped by hand. Along narrow village roads, these homes stood close together beneath the dry sun. Their flat roofs gathered dust from the desert wind. Their walls cracked slowly under years of heat. A farmer's home might only have a few small rooms. The floor was packed dirt. The ceilings were made from wooden beams covered with reeds and mud. Light entered through tiny openings cut high into the walls, keeping the harsh sun outside as much as possible. Inside, the air could feel heavy and warm even in the early morning. Before sunrise, families slowly woke in darkness. A mother might rise first, quietly stepping across the cool floor while her children still slept beside each other on woven mats. There were no soft beds filled with comfort. Most people slept on low wooden frames or simple mats stuffed with reeds or straw. Linen cloth sometimes covered them during cooler nights, though many nights remained warm until dawn. The sounds of waking Egypt were gentle at first. The brushing of sandals against dirt floors. The soft scrape of pottery jars being moved. The low crackle of a fire being rebuilt from fading ashes. Outside, the sky slowly turned gray-blue beyond the rooftops. In many homes, the first task of the day was grinding grain. This work happened every single morning. Women often knelt beside large stone grinding slabs, pushing smaller stones back and forth over wheat or barley. It was tiring work. Slow work. The motion repeated endlessly until the grain became flour. The sound filled the room in a soft rhythm. Stone against stone. Back and forth. Again and again. Flour dust settled onto hands, arms, and clothing. Tiny particles floated through thin morning light. Children sometimes woke to these familiar sounds, listening quietly while still half asleep beneath linen cloths. Bread was the center of daily life in Egypt. Every household depended on it. Rich or poor, nearly everyone ate bread each day beside the river. Dough was mixed in clay bowls with water and coarse grain. Sometimes herbs or dates were added when available, though many loaves remained plain and simple. The ovens were often built from clay outside the home or in shared cooking spaces. Fires burned hot beneath the growing morning heat. Smoke drifted upward into the brightening sky while workers prepared for another long day. By sunrise, villages had fully awakened. Men walked dusty roads carrying farming tools over their shoulders. Fishermen headed toward the riverbanks where narrow boats waited in shallow water. Donkeys moved slowly between homes carrying baskets, jars, or bundles of reeds. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried while older children chased each other through narrow alleys before being called back to chores. The smell of baking bread mixed with smoke, sweat, river mud, and warm earth. Ancient Egyptian homes were busy places from morning until night. Life was deeply connected to labor. There was always something to repair, clean, carry, grind, wash, build, or prepare. The desert climate covered everything with dust. Sand entered homes through doorways and windows. Floors needed sweeping almost constantly. Water had to be carried by hand from wells or from the Nile itself. This task alone could consume hours every day. At the riverbanks, women and children filled heavy clay jars with muddy water. They balanced them carefully against shoulders or carried them using wooden poles. The journey home beneath the growing heat could be exhausting. Sandals pressed into soft earth while insects drifted above the water reeds nearby. The Nile gave life to Egypt, but daily life beside it was rarely easy. During flood season, water covered fields and changed the shape of roads and villages. During the hottest months, the dry air could feel endless. Skin became rough beneath the sun. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads to protect themselves while sweat darkened their clothing. Inside the homes, there was little privacy. Families lived closely together. Several generations often shared the same small space. Grandparents rested in shaded corners while mothers cooked nearby and children slept beside walls during the hottest hours of the afternoon. The walls themselves held the memory of countless hands. Mud bricks were made from Nile mud mixed with straw. Workers shaped them in wooden molds and left them beneath the sun to harden. Over time, homes slowly wore down from weather and use. Cracks appeared. Corners crumbled. Repairs never truly ended. In wealthier neighborhoods near larger cities, some homes were bigger and cooler. Scribes, officials, and merchants sometimes owned houses with several rooms and inner courtyards. Their walls might be painted white to reflect sunlight. Some had gardens with small trees offering shade from the burning afternoon heat. But even these homes still depended on endless daily chores. Servants swept floors. Water jars needed filling. Food spoiled quickly in the heat. Clothing required washing by hand beside the river. Oil lamps needed trimming and refilling after dark. Nothing remained clean or orderly for very long in the dusty Egyptian climate. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the streets became brighter and harsher. Workers moved carefully through crowded roads lined with workshops and market stalls. Potters shaped wet clay beneath shaded roofs. Carpenters cut wood slowly by hand. Stone workers chipped at blocks beneath clouds of pale dust. The sounds of labor echoed through the villages and cities all day long. Hammering. Voices. Animals. Footsteps. The turning of grinding stones. The splash of water against river boats. For ordinary Egyptians, exhaustion was simply part of life. Farmers worked long hours bending over fields of grain beside irrigation canals. The soil near the Nile was rich and dark, but farming required constant attention. Water channels had to be maintained carefully. Tools needed repair. Animals wandered. Crops failed sometimes under disease or poor flooding. A farmer's hands became rough very early in life. Children often began helping their families while still young. Boys followed fathers into fields or workshops. Girls learned cooking, cleaning, weaving, and carrying water from their mothers. There was little time for rest once daylight arrived. And yet, small moments of peace still existed inside these ordinary lives. At midday, workers sometimes rested briefly beneath shade trees or beside walls cooling in the river breeze. Bread was eaten slowly with onions, beans, or dried fish. Water jars passed from hand to hand. People sat quietly while heat shimmered across the distant fields. Even silence felt tired beneath the Egyptian sun. Back inside the homes, the afternoon hours moved heavily. The hottest part of the day often forced people indoors when possible. Children slept. Older people rested against cool walls. Mothers repaired clothing or prepared evening meals while listening to flies buzz lazily through the room. Light entered through narrow windows in soft golden beams. Dust floated slowly through the air. Some homes kept small household shrines with figures of protective gods placed in quiet corners. A tiny offering of bread or flowers might sit nearby. A whispered prayer could rise softly before returning once again to ordinary chores. Religion in Egypt lived quietly inside homes as much as inside temples. People hoped for protection from illness, bad harvests, snake bites, fevers, and accidents. Life could change quickly beside the Nile. Even small wounds sometimes became dangerous in the heat. Medical knowledge existed, but ordinary families often relied on herbs, prayers, and simple remedies passed through generations. Illness moved silently through crowded homes. Workers suffered from aching backs, swollen joints, infected cuts, damaged teeth, and exhaustion. Years of grinding grain filled the air with stone dust that slowly harmed the lungs. Farmers carried heavy loads beneath brutal sunlight. Builders dragged limestone blocks across rough ground. Fishermen spent long hours beneath glaring reflections off river water. By evening, bodies felt worn and heavy. As sunlight softened into orange and gold, workers slowly returned home along dusty roads. The temperature finally began to ease. Smoke rose once more from cooking fires across the villages. Boats drifted quietly toward shore. Birds circled low above the reeds. The evening meal was often simple. Bread. Beer made from grain. Beans. Lentils. Onions. Sometimes fish from the river. Meat was less common for ordinary people, though festivals occasionally brought larger meals shared among families and neighbors. Inside the homes, the warm glow of oil lamps returned again. Shadows flickered softly against mud brick walls. The sounds of the day slowly faded into quieter voices and tired breathing. Children listened to stories while lying on mats. Parents spoke softly about work waiting tomorrow. Outside, footsteps became less frequent. The desert wind cooled the streets little by little. Above the villages, the stars appeared once more over Egypt. Nighttime could feel deeply peaceful after the endless labor of the day. Families climbed onto flat rooftops to escape the trapped heat inside their homes. Up there, beneath the open sky, cooler air drifted slowly from the river. Some people slept outdoors during the hottest seasons, wrapped lightly in linen while insects hummed faintly in the darkness. The rooftops became quiet islands above the sleeping streets. Nearby, somewhere beyond the village, water moved softly through the Nile reeds. And while kings ordered monuments and priests lit temple fires, most Egyptians simply rested their tired bodies beneath the stars, preparing to wake before dawn and begin it all once again. Long before the first sunlight touched the tops of the temples, ancient Egypt was already beginning to stir once more. The air before dawn carried a strange softness beside the Nile. The heat of the previous day had finally faded from the mud brick walls, and for a short while the villages felt almost cool. A thin gray mist sometimes hovered above the riverbanks. Reeds bent gently in the moving air while small insects drifted over the dark water. Inside the homes, families still slept closely together. Children curled beneath linen cloths. A father rested with one arm beneath his head after returning late from irrigation work. An elderly grandmother breathed slowly in the corner beside stacked baskets and clay jars. The room smelled faintly of smoke from last night's cooking fire, mixed with dust and dry reeds from the sleeping mats. Then somewhere outside, a wooden door creaked open. Footsteps moved quietly through the narrow street. Another day had begun. For many women in Egypt, the earliest moments before sunrise were often the only peaceful moments of the entire day. In the silence before the streets filled with voices and labor, they prepared the household for waking life. A mother knelt beside a small clay oven, gently blowing air into fading embers until orange light returned beneath the ashes. Sparks drifted upward into the darkness of the room. She wrapped her linen clothing tightly around herself against the slight coolness of morning. Nearby, grain waited in woven baskets. The grinding stones waited too. Every day the work began again. The motion of grinding grain could last for hours. Knees pressed against hard floors while heavy stones scraped back and forth in steady rhythm. Women developed strong shoulders and arms from this work. Their fingers became rough from flour and stone dust. Sometimes younger daughters joined beside them, learning the motion slowly while still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Outside, roosters cried into the fading darkness. Dogs wandered through the alleys searching for scraps. The smell of damp river mud drifted into the village on the morning wind. In wealthier homes, servants often performed many of these chores before sunrise. Large households belonging to officials or merchants depended on servants for nearly everything. Young servant girls carried water, swept courtyards, cleaned dishes, and prepared bread while the owners of the house remained asleep a little longer. But even servants rested very little. Their days stretched endlessly from darkness into darkness. Inside larger homes, inner courtyards slowly brightened beneath the coming sunrise. Palm leaves rustled overhead. Painted walls reflected soft golden light. Some homes even had small pools or gardens, though these quiet luxuries required constant care in the dry Egyptian climate. Dust gathered everywhere. Leaves dried quickly beneath the heat. Water evaporated fast beneath the burning sun. Every beautiful thing demanded labor. As dawn arrived fully, the Nile itself became busy again. Fishermen stepped carefully into narrow wooden boats while balancing woven nets across their shoulders. The river water reflected pale pink morning light as they pushed away from shore using long poles. Ripples spread softly behind them. Some fishermen worked alone in silence. Others traveled in small groups, speaking quietly while birds circled overhead. Fishing fed many Egyptian families. Fish could be dried, salted, cooked fresh, or traded in local markets. But fishing along the Nile was uncertain work. Nets tore easily. Crocodiles lived in certain areas of the river. Hippos sometimes overturned small boats without warning. Even calm water carried danger. Still, the river remained the center of life. Children learned to swim in its shallow edges. Farmers depended on its flooding cycles. Merchants carried goods upon it. Priests gathered sacred water from it. Nearly every ordinary chore in Egypt connected in some way to the Nile. Without the river, the land beyond became silent desert. As the villages fully awakened, narrow streets slowly filled with movement. Sandals brushed against dusty ground. Donkeys carried sacks of grain toward storage buildings. Men walked together toward fields while discussing irrigation channels or damaged tools. The sunlight grew stronger quickly. Egyptian mornings never stay gentle for long. In farming villages, workers hurried to finish difficult tasks before the full weight of midday heat arrived. Fields stretched green beside the riverbanks where the Nile had left rich dark soil after flooding. Wheat swayed softly in the warm wind. Date palms stood above irrigation canals while insects hummed through the reeds. Farmers bent low over the earth hour after hour. Their work followed the rhythm of the river itself. Planting season brought long days pressing seeds into wet soil. Harvest season became even harder. Men cut grain with curved sickles while women bundled stalks beneath clouds of dust and chaff. The dry air scratched their throats. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Hands blistered beneath constant labor. Children gathered fallen grain behind the adults. Even small children carried responsibilities. A young boy might spend his day chasing birds away from crops or helping guide animals through the fields. A young girl could spend hours carrying water jars, cleaning cooking bowls, or helping care for younger brothers and sisters. There was little separation between childhood and labor. Life itself demanded participation from everyone. Back in the villages, workshops opened as sunlight flooded the streets. Potters sat before spinning wheels shaping wet clay into jars, bowls, and storage containers. Their hands moved with practiced calm while the smell of damp earth filled the shaded rooms. Nearby, weavers worked slowly at wooden looms. Threads stretched tightly across frames. The soft clicking of weaving filled the air like quiet rain. Linen cloth was precious in Egypt. Clothing, blankets, sails, wrappings, and household goods all depended on woven linen. The process took enormous effort. Flax plants had to be harvested, soaked, dried, combed, spun into thread, and finally woven by hand. Simple fabric carried many invisible hours inside it. In another part of the village, scribes sat cross-legged with brushes and papyrus sheets spread before them. Scribes lived differently from most workers. Their hands were stained with ink instead of mud or stone dust. They recorded taxes, trade shipments, temple supplies, harvest numbers, and legal matters. Writing offered a rare escape from physical labor. Parents sometimes dreamed of sons becoming scribes because the work was cleaner and less exhausting than farming or construction. But learning to write required years of training. Most ordinary Egyptians never learned the complex symbols of written language. Still, scribes remained surrounded by the same dusty world as everyone else. Even inside official buildings, heat gathered heavily by midday. Flies buzzed through open windows. Ink dried quickly in the desert air. Outside the cities, labor gangs worked beneath brutal sunlight building tombs, roads, canals, and temples. Contrary to later myths, many builders were not slaves but paid workers and laborers completing seasonal work for the state. Their lives, however, remained physically exhausting beyond imagination. Stone had to be cut from quarries using simple tools. Blocks weighing enormous amounts were dragged across wooden sleds over sand. Ropes strained. Voices shouted. Bodies leaned together beneath the burning sky. The workers slept in crowded camps near construction sites. Their homes were small, packed tightly together, often little more than narrow rooms filled with sleeping mats and cooking pots. At night they returned exhausted, their skin covered with dust and sweat from limestone and sandstone. Meals remained simple. Bread, beer, onions, sometimes dried fish. The beer of ancient Egypt was thick and nourishing rather than luxurious. It provided calories and safer hydration than stagnant water. Workers drank it daily from clay cups while resting briefly in whatever shade they could find. Some evenings, after labor ended, tired workers sat quietly outside their homes watching the sky darken over the desert cliffs. Muscles ached deeply after long days hauling stone. Feet cracked beneath constant walking. Shoulders carried permanent soreness. Yet life continued steadily. Tomorrow's labor always waited. Inside ordinary homes, women spent much of the day preparing food. Bread alone demanded endless attention. Dough had to be kneaded, shaped, baked, and protected from insects and dust. Grain storage was a constant concern because mice and moisture could destroy precious supplies. Cooking fires made homes even hotter. Smoke blackened ceilings. Eyes stung from the heat. Clay pots simmered slowly over open flames while women stirred lentils or crushed herbs with stone tools. The smell of garlic, onions, and baked grain drifted through the narrow streets during the afternoon hours. Water remained one of the greatest daily burdens. There were no pipes carrying fresh water into homes. Every drop needed carrying, storing, and protecting carefully. Clay jars lined the walls of many houses. Cool water slowly seeped through porous pottery surfaces, helping lower the temperature slightly in the crushing heat. Even so, the water could become muddy or stale quickly. Illness spread easily in crowded settlements. Doctors existed in ancient Egypt, especially in larger cities, but ordinary people mostly treated sickness at home. Honey covered wounds because it slowed infection. Herbs were crushed into medicines. Oil soothed dry skin cracked by the desert air. Still, many people suffered quietly. Tooth pain was common because stone particles from grinding grain mixed into bread over many years, slowly wearing teeth down until eating became painful. Workers developed damaged joints from lifting and bending. Eye infections spread in dusty villages beneath bright sunlight. Life expectancy remained short for many ordinary Egyptians. And yet the world around them still held moments of beauty. Toward evening, when the worst heat finally loosened its grip upon the land, a softer feeling returned beside the Nile. Shadows lengthened across fields and rooftops. The golden sunlight turned deeper and calmer. Birds flew low over the river water while boats drifted slowly home. Children played again in the cooling streets. Women sat together weaving baskets or repairing linen. Old men rested against warm walls speaking quietly about flood seasons from long ago. The evening hours belonged to exhaustion, but also to relief. Cooking fires glowed once more across the villages. Smoke rose lazily into the darkening sky. The smell of fresh bread returned again. Somewhere nearby, music from a simple reed flute drifted softly through the warm air before fading into silence. Inside the homes, oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls. Families gathered closely for the evening meal. Hands tore bread slowly. Clay cups passed between tired fingers. Voices remained low after such long days of labor. Outside, the Nile continued moving through the darkness exactly as it had for countless generations. And above the quiet rooftops of Egypt, beneath endless stars shining over desert and river alike, ordinary people slowly prepared themselves for another brief night of rest before dawn returned once again. The deeper hours of night often brought the greatest silence to ancient Egypt. Long after the workshops closed and the cooking fires dimmed into soft red ash, the villages beside the Nile settled into stillness. Warm wind moved slowly through narrow alleys between mud brick homes. Palm branches whispered softly overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, water tapped gently against the sides of tide boats resting along the riverbanks. Most people slept lightly. The heat remained trapped inside the walls long after sunset, especially during the hottest months of the year. Families shifted slowly on woven mats, searching for cooler places against the floor or beneath the open sky on rooftops. Linen cloth stuck softly against tired skin. Children murmured in their sleep while insects buzzed faintly in the darkness. Then, little by little, the stars began fading again. Morning always returned quickly in Egypt. For farmers living near the Nile floodplains, the first light of dawn carried both hope and worry. Their entire lives depended on the river's behavior. If the flooding arrived gently, crops could grow well in the dark fertile soil left behind by the waters. But if the floods were weak or unpredictable, hunger quietly entered the villages. The Nile decided much of life. Each season carried different routines. During flood season, fields disappeared beneath wide sheets of water reflecting the pale sky. Farmers repaired tools, worked on construction projects, or performed labor for temples and officials while waiting for the waters to retreat. Boats moved where roads had once been. Villages sometimes felt smaller and more isolated during these months. Then eventually the flood waters withdrew again, leaving behind thick dark mud rich with life. And once more, the labor began. In the coolness before sunrise, farmers walked toward the wet fields carrying wooden hoes and simple tools over their shoulders. Their sandals pressed into soft earth still damp from the river. Birds called from the reeds while the eastern horizon slowly brightened into gold. The land smelled alive after flooding. Mud. Wet plants. River water warming beneath the coming sun. For many workers, these early hours were the easiest part of the day. The air remained gentle enough for conversation. Men spoke quietly while working beside one another in the fields. Some discussed crop yields or canal repairs. Others simply worked in silence, saving energy for the long hours ahead. Women often remained closer to the villages during the morning hours, though their work was no less demanding. Laundry needed washing beside the riverbanks. Children needed feeding. Grain needed grinding. Floors needed sweeping. Clothing required mending almost constantly because rough labor wore fabric down quickly. Near the river, women knelt beside smooth stones washing linen garments in shallow water. They beat cloth against rocks to remove dirt and sweat gathered from days of labor beneath the sun. Wet linen clung heavily to their arms while reeds swayed nearby in the breeze. The riverbanks became places of endless daily movement. Women filled jars with water. Children splashed in the shallows. Fishermen repaired torn nets. Donkeys drank noisily near muddy edges. Voices carried softly across the water. Sometimes small arguments rose between neighbors over space, water access, or missing tools. But most people depended too heavily on one another to remain angry for long. Village life required cooperation. When homes needed repair after storms or flooding, neighbors often helped each other rebuild damaged walls and roofs. Mud brick homes demanded constant care. The dry climate cracked walls slowly over time. Sudden rainstorms, though rare, could damage roofs badly. Roofs were usually made from wooden beams covered with layers of reeds, mud, and straw. They worked well against sunlight but wore down gradually beneath years of heat. After heavy flooding seasons, repairs became especially important. Families mixed fresh mud with straw beneath their feet, pressing the mixture carefully before shaping new bricks by hand. Children sometimes carried water for the work while older relatives repaired walls under the hot afternoon sky. The smell of wet earth filled the air during these repairs. Fresh mud dried quickly beneath the Egyptian sun. Inside the homes, daily life continued in small repetitive rhythms that rarely changed from one generation to the next. Clay jars lined the walls storing grain, beer, oil, and dried food. Wooden stools sat low against the floor. Woven baskets held vegetables, fishing tools, or sewing supplies. There were few unnecessary possessions. Everything inside the home had purpose. Even wealthier families lived more simply than many people imagine today. A comfortable Egyptian house might contain painted furniture, decorated walls, fine linen, and carefully carved wooden chests, but dust and heat still entered daily life no matter how wealthy someone became. Servants swept constantly. Fans made from reeds moved warm air slowly through rooms. Perfumed oils helped cover the smell of sweat during the hottest seasons. But Egypt itself always remained present. The dry wind. The dust. The brightness of the sun against pale stone. In larger towns, marketplaces slowly filled as morning continued. Merchants arranged goods beneath shaded cloth coverings while customers moved carefully through crowded streets. Pottery, sandals, fish, onions, woven baskets, linen cloth, oils, and tools passed from hand to hand through barter and trade. The market smelled of many things at once. Fresh bread. Animal dung. Fish drying in the heat. Smoke rising from cooking fires. Sweat from crowded bodies moving beneath the sun. Flies drifted everywhere. A merchant selling dates wiped dust from his face while calling softly to passing customers. Nearby, a basket maker repaired damaged reeds beneath the shade of a narrow awning. Children carried bundles for their parents through the noisy streets while stray dogs searched for scraps along the edges of the market. By midday, heat covered everything. The white sunlight above Egypt could feel almost heavy during the hottest months. Stone walls burned beneath direct sunlight. Air shimmered above roads and rooftops. Workers wrapped damp cloth around their heads or rested briefly in narrow patches of shade whenever possible. Inside workshops, conditions became difficult. Metal workers stood near burning furnaces while sweat rolled down their backs. Potters worked beside hot kilns. Bakers remained surrounded by oven heat for hours at a time. Even scribes struggled against exhaustion as ink dried quickly and flies buzzed around their work tables. The afternoon hours stretched slowly. Bodies tired. Tempers shortened. Children became quiet beneath the crushing warmth. Some families ate their main meal later in the evening when temperatures finally softened. During the hottest hours, lighter food and watered beer helped workers continue through the day. Water jars stood in shaded corners wrapped in damp cloth to keep them cooler. Rest itself became precious. An elderly man might sleep briefly beside a shaded wall while holding a woven fan loosely in his hand. A child curled quietly beside storage baskets while flies buzzed lazily through the room. Even animals sought relief from the heat. Dogs slept beneath carts. Donkeys stood motionless in narrow shadows. Beyond the villages and towns, travelers crossed Egypt's dusty roads beneath endless sunlight. Merchants led donkeys loaded with goods between settlements. Government messengers hurried along river paths carrying official orders. Priests traveled toward distant temples. Laborers moved wherever work could be found. Travel in Egypt was slow and tiring. Sand entered sandals with every step. Water had to be carried carefully. The desert beyond the Nile Valley always waited just outside the green edges of civilization. At night, however, those same roads became strangely peaceful beneath moonlight. The heat faded. Stars returned. And the distant sound of river water could sometimes be heard across the dark land. Back inside the villages, evening slowly approached once more. Women prepared cooking fires while children gathered reeds or animal dung for fuel. Men returned from fields carrying tools darkened with mud and sweat. Boats drifted back toward shore loaded with fish or bundles of papyrus reeds. The sky over Egypt turned deep orange. Palm trees became dark shapes against the fading light. Smoke rose upward from hundreds of cooking fires together. Evening meals brought temporary comfort after the long labor of the day. Families gathered close inside small rooms or on rooftops where cooler air finally moved through the village again. Bread was torn apart slowly by tired hands. Stew simmered quietly in clay pots. Beer passed from parent to child in simple cups. Conversation remained soft. Most people saved their energy carefully. Sometimes musicians played during festivals or religious celebrations, filling the streets with drums, singing, and reed flutes. but ordinary evenings were often much quieter. The people of Egypt lived with constant physical exhaustion. By nightfall many workers barely had strength left for long conversation. Children often fell asleep first. Their heads rested against parents' shoulders while oil lamps flickered nearby. Older family members watched the darkness settle over the rooftops and riverbanks. And slowly, the village sounds faded one by one. A final cooking pot being moved. A wooden door closing. Footsteps disappearing into silence. Far out on the Nile, fishermen checked their tide boats beneath moonlight while cool wind moved gently across the water. The river reflected the stars in broken silver patterns. Reeds swayed softly near the muddy banks where frogs croaked in the darkness. Egypt at night could feel endless. Quiet. Warm. Ancient. And in thousands of simple mud brick homes beside the slow-moving river, ordinary people rested their aching bodies once again beneath the same stars that had watched over their ancestors for countless generations before them. In the softer months, when the air over the Nile became a little cooler and the evenings arrived with gentler winds, life inside Egyptian homes felt slightly easier to bear. The heavy heat never disappeared completely, but there were nights when families could sleep more deeply. Cool air drifted slowly across the rooftops after sunset. Palm leaves rustled in the darkness, and the river carried the scent of wet reeds far into the villages. During these quieter seasons, some families spent long evening hours outside their homes rather than inside them. Neighbors sat together beneath fading light while repairing fishing nets or weaving baskets from river reeds. Children rested sleepily beside their parents after long days beneath the sun. The streets became softer at night. Oil lamps glowed faintly through narrow doorways. Voices stayed low and unhurried. For ordinary Egyptians, home was not only a shelter from the weather. It was also the center of nearly every part of life. Births happened there. Meals were prepared there. Illness was treated there. Children learned their earliest chores there. Elderly relatives spent their final days there while family members moved quietly around them with care and patience. Most homes smelled strongly of daily life. Smoke from cooking fires clung to walls and clothing. Bread dough rested in clay bowls. Stored onions and garlic filled corners with sharp earthy scents. Dust settled over nearly everything by the end of each day. Animals sometimes lived very close to the household too. Goats, chickens, or ducks might sleep beside the home or within small enclosed spaces nearby. Their sounds blended into the ordinary rhythm of village life. A rooster crowing before sunrise. Goats shifting softly in the night. The flutter of birds startled awake from rooftop shadows. The world of ancient Egypt was rarely silent for long. Even before dawn, the first workers began moving once again through the darkness. Bakers rose especially early because bread required many hours of preparation before the markets opened. In larger towns, bakeries became warm and crowded before sunrise. Men mixed flour in large bowls while ovens glowed orange in the dim light. Sweat appeared quickly beside the fires. Hands moved steadily through familiar routines. The smell of baking bread drifted into nearby streets while the sky was still dark blue above the rooftops. For many Egyptians, bread and beer together formed the foundation of survival. Workers received them as wages. Families depended on them every day. Even poor harvests or rising grain costs could quietly bring fear into a household because hunger always remained close beneath the surface of ordinary life. Food storage was constant work. Grain had to stay dry. Clay jars needed sealing carefully against insects and moisture. Rats and mice threatened precious supplies stored for future months. Women checked storage jars often, lifting lids carefully in the dim interior of the home. A spoiled supply of grain could mean terrible hardship for an entire family. Nothing in Egypt could be wasted easily. The desert beyond the Nile Valley offered little mercy. In farming communities farther from major cities, homes were sometimes built in clusters along narrow dirt paths leading toward irrigation canals and fields. The houses stood close together beneath the glaring sky, their mud brick walls almost blending into the color of the earth itself. From a distance, villages could appear nearly hidden against the landscape. Only smoke from cooking fires or the movement of people revealed the life inside them. Children often woke hungry after sleeping through warm nights. Morning meals remained simple and small for many families. Bread dipped in beer or eaten with onions might be enough before labor began again. Then the village slowly emptied. Men walked toward fields carrying hoes and wooden plows. Women headed toward riverbanks with empty jars balanced carefully against their hips. Older children followed behind adults already learning the patterns that would shape the rest of their lives. There was comfort in routine, even when the work was exhausting. The same roads. The same chores. The same rising and setting sun above the Nile. For scribes and officials living inside larger towns, daily life looked somewhat different but still followed steady rhythms. Their homes sometimes included separate storage rooms, painted walls, and furniture carved from imported wood. Some wealthy families owned servants who completed the hardest physical labor. Yet comfort remained fragile even for them. Summer heat entered every building. Mosquitoes gathered near water during certain seasons. Disease spread through crowded streets regardless of wealth. A wealthy official might sit writing documents inside a shaded room while servants moved quietly nearby carrying water jars or cleaning floors. Outside his walls, however, workers dragged stone beneath brutal sunlight, and fishermen balanced carefully in narrow riverboats beneath the same burning sky. Egypt connected every life through labor. Even temples depended on countless ordinary workers hidden behind the beauty of painted walls and towering columns. Servants cleaned temple courtyards at dawn. Bakers prepared offerings of bread for rituals. Farmers worked temple-owned land beside irrigation canals. Scribes counted grain stores and livestock. The great monuments of Egypt rested upon endless daily chores performed quietly by ordinary hands. Inside the homes of craftsmen, tools occupied precious space beside sleeping mats and storage jars. A carpenter might keep chisels and wooden pieces stacked carefully against the wall. A potter stored clay beside baskets of finished bowls waiting for market day. A weaver's loom could fill nearly an entire room. Home and work often existed together. There was little separation between labor and private life. Children grew up surrounded by the sounds of their parents' trades. The scrape of carving tools. The spinning of pottery wheels. The tapping of weaving frames. The sharpening of blades against stone. By midday the heat once again pressed heavily over Egypt. The sunlight reflected brightly from pale walls and dry roads. Dogs slept beneath carts with tongues hanging from their mouths. Flies gathered thickly around marketplaces and cooking areas. Inside many homes, the afternoon became quieter. Children rested. Older people slept lightly in shaded corners. Women repaired clothing or prepared vegetables while listening to distant street sounds drifting through the windows. Some afternoons carried a strange stillness. Even the birds seemed slower in the heat. Outside the villages, workers along the Nile canals continued laboring despite exhaustion. Irrigation systems required careful maintenance year after year. Mud walls collapsed. Water channels became blocked with reeds and silt. Farmers repaired them constantly beneath the hot sky. The canals themselves shimmered in sunlight. Dragonflies hovered above the water. Bare feet pressed into wet mud along the narrow banks. Without irrigation, crops would fail quickly beneath Egypt's dry climate. Every canal carried survival through the fields. Workers understood this deeply even while their backs ached from bending and lifting. Life beside the Nile demanded patience more than comfort. In the late afternoon, shadows finally began growing longer across the villages again. The fierce brightness softened little by little. Workers returning from fields moved slowly now, their energy nearly gone after long hours beneath the sun. Dust clung to their legs and clothing. Sweat dried white against their skin. Their sandals wore thin from endless walking. At the riverbanks, fishermen cleaned their catch while birds circled overhead hoping for scraps. Children waited nearby watching quietly as silver fish flashed in the fading light. Some families would cook fish immediately over evening fires while others salted or dried them for later use. The smell of river water mixed with smoke and cooking food. Evening always brought relief. Not complete rest, but relief. As darkness slowly covered the Nile Valley once more, homes filled with softer sounds. Clay bowls scraped gently against floors. Oil lamps flickered near sleeping mats. Mothers washed dust from children's faces before bed while fathers stretched sore muscles after laboring all day. Some families climbed onto rooftops carrying blankets and small pillows stuffed with reeds. Above them, the sky opened wide and clear. The stars over Egypt could appear endless on quiet nights far from the larger cities. Without bright lamps or crowded streets, the heavens stretched deeply across the darkness. Constellations reflected softly upon the slow-moving Nile while warm wind drifted through the palms. An old man resting on a rooftop might remember flood seasons from his childhood. A mother might quietly hum beside a sleeping child. Nearby, another family whispered softly about tomorrow's work before falling silent. And beneath those ancient stars, surrounded by mud brick walls still warm from the day's heat, ordinary Egyptians closed their tired eyes once again while the river continued flowing endlessly through the darkness beside them. There were mornings in ancient Egypt when the wind arrived early from the desert. Before the sun had fully risen, dry air carried fine sand across the roads and rooftops. The palm trees near the Nile bent softly beneath the moving breeze while thin clouds of dust drifted between the mud brick homes. Inside the villages, people woke slowly to the sound of wind brushing against walls and doorways. A mother covered rising bread dough with cloth to keep dust away. A child rubbed tired eyes while listening to the soft rattling of reeds overhead. An old man stepped outside carefully, looking toward the pale horizon where sunlight was beginning to spread across the land. The desert was always close to Egypt. Beyond the narrow green valley of the Nile stretched miles of silence and stone. Most ordinary people rarely traveled far into it, yet they felt its presence every day through the heat, the dry air, and the endless dust that settled over their homes and bodies. Life beside the river depended upon constant cleaning. Floors needed sweeping again and again. Storage jars had to remain sealed. Cooking areas became dusty almost immediately after being cleaned. Women spent long hours simply trying to keep order inside crowded homes where several people shared small spaces together. Reed brooms brushed across packed dirt floors while sunlight entered through narrow windows in pale golden beams. Dust floated gently through the air. It settled on hair, clothing, baskets, sleeping mats, and shelves. No matter how carefully a home was cleaned, the desert always returned. In wealthier households, servants often woke before everyone else to prepare the rooms for the day. They swept courtyards, carried fresh water, lit lamps in darker hallways, and opened shutters to allow cooler morning air inside before the full heat arrived. Large homes sometimes appeared peaceful from the outside, but inside them servants moved constantly from one task to another. Water jars emptied quickly. Linen clothing required washing. Food had to be prepared fresh each day. Oil lamps left smoke stains on walls and ceilings. Even comfort required endless labor hidden beneath it. For poorer families, every task was completed by the household itself. A woman might spend the entire day moving between chores without ever truly resting. Grinding grain alone could take several hours. Then there was baking, cleaning, weaving, carrying water, caring for children, repairing clothing, feeding animals, and preparing the evening meal. By nightfall, her body ached with exhaustion. Yet morning always returned again. The rhythm of Egyptian life rarely changed. Near the Nile, fishermen pushed their boats into the calm morning water while mist still hovered above the surface. The river looked almost silver beneath the first sunlight. Birds stood motionless in the reeds waiting for fish beneath the quiet sky. Fishing required patience. Men cast woven nets carefully into shallow water or used spears while balancing silently inside narrow wooden boats. Some fishermen remained on the river for many hours beneath the growing heat, their skin darkened by sunlight reflected from the water. The Nile could appear peaceful, but it demanded respect. Strong currents moved beneath the surface. Crocodiles hid near muddy banks in certain regions. Hippos sometimes destroyed boats or attacked without warning. Even experienced fishermen understood how quickly calm water could become dangerous. Still, countless Egyptian families depended upon the river's fish for survival. Back inside the villages, children began their daily responsibilities early. Many carried small clay jars to fetch water or gathered animal dung for fuel used in cooking fires. Others watched younger brothers and sisters while adults worked. Very few children lived without chores. A young girl might already know how to knead dough, sweep floors, and weave simple baskets before reaching adulthood. A young boy learned to repair tools, tend animals, or assist in the fields beside his father. The work of life surrounded them from birth. Yet childhood still found small moments to exist quietly between labor. Children chased each other through dusty streets before being called back to work. They floated reeds along irrigation canals. They laughed beside the riverbanks while washing in shallow water during the hottest hours. Simple games appeared and disappeared quickly like small flashes of light inside otherwise difficult lives. In larger towns, markets became crowded as the day continued. Merchants shaded themselves beneath cloth coverings while arranging goods carefully on low tables or woven mats. Pottery gleamed softly in sunlight. Fish lay drying beside baskets of onions and dates. Linen cloth moved gently in the warm breeze. The market sounds rose slowly into the air. Footsteps on packed earth. Low conversations. Donkeys snorting impatiently. Clay bowls knocking softly together. Unlike the grand monuments later remembered through history, these marketplaces carried the true daily heartbeat of Egypt. Here ordinary people traded the small things needed to survive another week beside the Nile. A farmer exchanged grain for sandals. A fisherman traded dried fish for oil. A mother searched carefully for cheaper vegetables while holding a sleepy child beside her. Most families lived close to hardship. A poor harvest, illness, or damaged home could quickly create suffering. There were no easy protections against hunger or exhaustion. Many workers pushed through sickness simply because their families depended upon them. Inside crowded homes, illness spread quietly. Fever moved through sleeping children. Coughs echoed in dark rooms during the night. Infected cuts became dangerous in the heat and dust. Egyptian medicine understood some treatments surprisingly well for the ancient world. Honey helped wounds heal. Certain herbs eased pain or stomach sickness. Doctors could set broken bones and treat some infections. But ordinary people still lived close to death in ways that shaped daily life deeply. Families understood how fragile the body could be beneath the hard labor of Egypt. An injured worker might lose the ability to support the household. A sick child could weaken quickly during hot seasons. Women faced serious danger during childbirth inside cramped homes with little comfort. Yet life continued with quiet endurance. Mothers still baked bread each morning. Farmers still repaired canals. Children still played in the dust beneath the evening sky. As afternoon settled heavily across the land once more, many streets became quieter. Workers moved more slowly now beneath the crushing sunlight. Even conversations shortened beneath the heat. Inside some homes, women spun flax fibers into thread while sitting near narrow windows where slight breezes entered. Their fingers worked almost automatically after years of practice. Thread wound slowly around wooden spindles while shadows shifted across the room. Nearby, an elderly relative rested against the wall with closed eyes. A baby slept softly beside stacked baskets. Outside, somewhere far away, a donkey brayed beneath the hot sky. Time itself seemed slower during Egyptian afternoons. The sunlight remained almost motionless above the land. Air shimmered over rooftops and roads. The smell of heated mud brick rose from the walls. Then eventually the light softened again. Evening approached once more beside the Nile. Workers returning from fields washed dust from their feet near water jars outside the home. Some bathed briefly in the river before sunset, standing quietly in shallow water while reeds moved nearby in the wind. The coolness felt temporary but precious. After long days beneath the sun, even small comfort mattered deeply. Inside the homes, cooking fires came alive again. Women stirred lentils or vegetable stews in clay pots while bread baked nearby. The smell drifted slowly through the streets as smoke rose upward into the orange evening sky. Families gathered close for the final meal of the day. Bodies moved more slowly now from exhaustion. Hands roughened by labor reached for bread and cups of beer. Children leaned sleepily against their parents while listening to soft evening conversations. Beyond the villages, the Nile reflected the fading light in long golden patterns. Boats drifted quietly toward shore. Birds crossed low above the water heading toward nests hidden among the reeds. Night approached gently over Egypt. The heat slowly loosened its grip upon the land. Stars appeared one by one above the river valley. And inside countless small homes built from mud and straw beside the ancient Nile, ordinary people prepared once more for another brief night of rest before dawn returned and the endless rhythm of chores, labor, dust, and river life quietly began again. Sometimes the nights beside the Nile felt almost cool. After long months of heavy heat, the change could feel gentle and comforting against tired skin. Families sleeping on rooftops pulled thin linen coverings a little closer around their shoulders while soft wind drifted through the darkness. The villages rested quietly beneath the stars. Oil lamps had burned low hours ago. Cooking fires were now only faint circles of red ash near doorways. Farther away, somewhere beyond the sleeping homes, frogs croaked beside the river reeds while water moved softly along the muddy banks. Ancient Egypt often appeared grand in the carvings left behind on temple walls, but the true rhythm of the land lived inside these ordinary nights. It lived in the tired breathing of workers asleep after endless labor. It lived in the rough hands resting beside woven mats. It lived in the silence that settled over villages where nearly everyone woke before dawn each morning. For many Egyptians, sleep itself was never deeply comfortable. Homes trapped heat during summer months. Insects drifted through windows and roof openings. Several family members often shared one room together. Babies cried during the night. Elderly relatives coughed softly in dark corners. And yet people adapted. They always adapted. Some households sprinkled water lightly onto floors before sleeping to cool the air a little. Others rested on rooftops beneath open skies where the wind from the river moved more freely. During cooler months, families sometimes slept closer together for warmth beneath linen blankets stuffed with reeds or wool. The body learned to rest wherever possible. Before sunrise, the villages slowly awakened once again. The first sound was often movement inside the homes themselves. A sleeping mat shifting. Clay bowls being lifted quietly. Sandals brushing across packed dirt floors. Then came the soft crackling of fires being rebuilt from yesterday's ashes. Morning chores began before daylight touched the Nile. In many homes, women worked silently at first so children could continue sleeping a little longer. They carried grain from storage jars, checked water supplies, and prepared dough for the day's bread. Their movements were calm from long habit. Every task had been repeated thousands of times before. Outside, the eastern sky slowly brightened behind rows of palm trees. Birds began calling from rooftops and irrigation canals. Somewhere nearby, a donkey stamped its feet impatiently while tied beside a wall. The air smelled briefly fresh before the heat returned. These early moments before sunrise were often the most peaceful time in Egypt. Even the river seemed quieter then. Fishermen pushed away from shore through pale morning mist while the Nile reflected the first silver light of dawn. Their boats moved slowly and carefully through the still water. Reeds brushed against wooden sides with soft whispering sounds. Some fishermen traveled far from the villages before sunrise. Others stayed near the banks setting traps or repairing damaged nets while waiting for better light. Fishing demanded patience and endurance much like every other form of labor in Egypt. Hours passed beneath direct sunlight with little shade on the water. Hands became rough from wet ropes and woven nets. Eyes strained against the bright reflection rising from the river surface. Yet the river remained beautiful in quiet ways. Pelicans drifted low across the water. Small fish flashed beneath the surface. Morning light spread slowly over the reeds and distant fields. Along the riverbanks, women and children soon arrived carrying empty jars for water. They walked carefully down narrow dirt paths worn smooth by countless footsteps over generations. Bare feet pressed into cool mud while insects hovered above the shallows. Fetching water was one of the most important daily tasks in Egyptian life. Without water, cooking stopped. Cleaning stopped. Animals suffered. The household itself could not function. Clay jars filled slowly beside the river. Some were small enough for children to carry, while larger jars required strong shoulders and careful balance. The return walk home became harder as sunlight grew hotter overhead. A woman might carry water several times each day. The weight strained the neck, arms, and back. Still, there were moments of quiet conversation beside the riverbanks. Neighbors exchanged news while filling jars. Children splashed lightly in shallow water before being scolded. Older women rested briefly beneath reeds while adjusting heavy containers against their hips. The Nile connected every household together. Back in the villages, the roads slowly filled again with workers heading toward fields, workshops, and construction sites. Dust rose beneath their sandals as sunlight spread across the land. The day's labor had begun once more. In farming regions, oxen pulled wooden plows slowly through dark soil near the irrigation canals. Farmers guided them carefully while birds followed behind searching for insects disturbed by the earth. Sweat appeared early beneath the strengthening heat. The fields required endless attention. Canals clogged with mud and reeds. Tools broke from constant use. Animals wandered. Floodwaters changed the shape of the land year after year. Farmers understood the moods of the Nile almost the way sailors understood the sea. They watched water levels carefully. They studied soil conditions beneath their feet. They noticed changes in wind, insects, and plant growth. Their survival depended upon these small observations. Inside the towns and cities, craftsmen already worked beneath shaded roofs before the full heat of midday arrived. Stonecutters chipped carefully at limestone blocks while pale dust covered their arms and faces. Carpenters shaped wood using simple hand tools passed down across generations. The sounds of work echoed through narrow streets. Hammering, sawing, grinding, voices calling between workshops. Nearby, weavers sat patiently before wooden looms. Linen thread stretched tightly across the frames while skilled hands moved back and forth in steady rhythm. Cloth slowly appeared line by line beneath their fingers. Weaving demanded long hours of concentration. Eyes tired. Backs stiffened. Hands cramped from repetitive motion. Yet fine linen remained valuable across Egypt. Wealthier households desired softer, cleaner cloth while temples required enormous amounts for rituals and offerings. Everything connected back to labor. Nothing appeared easily. As the morning advanced toward midday, the sunlight became almost blinding against pale walls and dusty roads. Marketplaces grew crowded and noisy before gradually slowing under the pressure of the heat. Merchants wiped sweat from their faces while protecting food from flies. Animals stood motionless beneath small patches of shade. Children became quieter and slower beneath the harsh sky. Inside ordinary homes, the afternoon heat gathered heavily once again. Mud brick walls helped somewhat, but the air still felt thick and tiring during the hottest hours. Some women paused briefly from work to rest beside cool storage jars or near shaded doorways. An elderly grandmother might fan herself slowly with woven reeds. A young mother rocked a sleeping child while staring quietly toward the bright doorway. Outside, the village itself seemed half asleep beneath the burning sun. Then eventually, little by little, the fierce brightness softened again. The long Egyptian afternoon began slipping toward evening. Farmers returned from the fields carrying tools darkened by dirt and sweat. Builders walked slowly home from construction sites with aching shoulders and cracked hands. Fishermen tied boats beside the riverbanks while sorting the day's catch beneath fading sunlight. Exhaustion settled over everything. But evening also carried relief. The air cooled gradually. Birdsong returned near the reeds. Smoke rose from cooking fires across the villages. Inside the homes, evening meals were prepared carefully from whatever the household could spare. Lentils simmered slowly in clay pots. Bread baked beside small fires. Fish roasted over glowing coals while children watched hungrily nearby. Meals were rarely luxurious, yet after long labor they brought comfort. Families gathered together in tired silence. The warm light from oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls. Outside, neighbors spoke quietly beneath darkening skies while sitting beside doorways or on rooftops catching the cooler night breeze. Sometimes musicians passed through larger villages during festivals or celebrations. Reed flutes and drums drifted softly through the night air while dancers moved beneath torchlight. But on ordinary evenings, Egypt remained calmer and quieter. Most people were simply too tired. As darkness deepened over the Nile Valley, the stars returned once again above the palm trees and distant desert hills. The river reflected pale moonlight in slow-moving patterns while warm wind carried the smell of water and reeds through the sleeping villages. And inside thousands of humble homes built beside the ancient Nile, ordinary Egyptians slowly drifted into another brief night of rest, their tired bodies preparing quietly for yet another day shaped by dust, labor, bread, river water, and the endless rhythm of daily chores beneath the Egyptian sun. Before the temples filled with priests and before the marketplaces echoed with voices, there was always the quiet hour just before dawn. It came softly across Egypt. The stars faded little by little above the Nile while darkness loosened its hold over the villages. The river turned from black to deep blue. Palm trees appeared slowly against the brightening horizon, their leaves motionless in the still morning air. For a few brief moments, the land felt calm and half asleep. Inside the homes, families rested close together beneath thin linen coverings. The warmth from the previous day still lingered inside the mud brick walls. A child shifted quietly in sleep. Someone coughed softly from a dark corner of the room. A clay jar creaked faintly as the cooling air settled around it. Then somewhere outside came the sound of footsteps. Another day was beginning. In many households, the women rose first again, just as they had the day before and the day before that. Their work never truly ended. Even during the night, part of the mind remained awake, already thinking about water, grain, bread, fuel, washing, children, and the countless small tasks waiting with the sunrise. One woman stepped carefully across the floor so she would not wake the younger children sleeping nearby. She knelt beside the cooking fire and pushed dry reeds into the old ashes until faint orange light slowly appeared. Smoke curled upward into the dim room. The smell of burned straw and clay filled the air. Outside, the eastern sky became pale gold. In homes across Egypt, grinding stones soon began their familiar rhythm once more. The sound spread softly through the waking villages like distant rain upon stone. Back and forth. Back and forth. Steady and slow. Women leaned over grinding slabs while flour dust settled across their hands and clothing. Muscles in the shoulders and arms tightened from years of repetition. Some had performed this same motion nearly every morning since childhood. Nearby, dough waited in clay bowls covered with linen cloth. Bread would need baking before the heat became too strong. As dawn fully arrived, the villages slowly came alive again. Doors opened. Sandals scraped across dirt roads. Donkeys brayed impatiently while tied beside walls or wooden carts. The smells of Egypt returned with the morning. Baking bread. River mud. Smoke. Animals. Dust already warming beneath the rising sun. Near the riverbanks, fishermen prepared their boats beneath pale morning light. Nets were checked carefully for damage from the previous day. Wooden poles knocked gently against the sides of boats floating in shallow water. Some fishermen spoke quietly together before pushing away from shore. Others preferred silence in the early morning calm. Mist hovered low over the Nile while birds circled above the reeds searching for food. The water reflected the changing sky in soft silver colors. For a short while, before the sun climbed higher, the river felt peaceful and cool. But work waited even here. Fishing could not be delayed. Nearby, farmers already moved toward the fields carrying hoes and baskets across their shoulders. Their bodies still ached from yesterday's labor, yet there was no choice except to continue. The land beside the Nile demanded constant effort. Irrigation canals needed clearing. Crops needed protection from birds and animals. Tools broke and required repair. Floodwaters changed the earth every year. A farmer's life was deeply tied to exhaustion. By midday, sweat soaked through linen clothing while sunlight burned against exposed skin. Feet hardened from years of walking over rough earth and stone. Hands cracked beneath dry air and heavy labor. Still, many farmers understood the land with quiet skill passed through generations. They noticed changes in soil color. They studied the water levels carefully. They knew which parts of the fields dried first beneath the heat and which remained fertile longer after the flooding season. These small pieces of knowledge protected families from hunger. Back inside the villages, women carried out laundry toward the riverbanks after sunrise. Linen garments, stained with sweat and dust, were washed in shallow water beside smooth stones. The work was tiring and repetitive. Wet fabric grew heavy in the hands. The sun reflected brightly from the river surface. Children played nearby until called back to help. Some women spoke quietly while washing clothes together. They shared news about harvests, illnesses, marriages, and births. Life in Egyptian villages was deeply connected. Privacy existed only in small moments because everyone lived close beside one another. If a family suffered hardship, neighbors usually knew quickly. If someone fell ill, word spread through the village before evening. The closeness could bring comfort, but it could also bring worry. Inside many homes, elderly relatives spent long hours seated near doorways or in shaded courtyards where the air moved more freely. Age brought respect in Egypt, but it also brought pain. Old injuries from years of labor remained inside the body. Knees stiffened. Backs curved slowly forward. Hands became swollen from decades of grinding grain, carrying water, or working in the fields. An old farmer resting beside the doorway might quietly watch younger workers passing through the street while remembering flood seasons from many years earlier. The rhythms of life continued around him. Children running through dust. Merchants carrying goods. The distant sound of hammering from workshops. Nothing truly stopped beside the Nile. As the day grew hotter, the workshops became heavy with heat and noise. Potters shaped clay while kilns burned nearby like small suns. Metal workers stood before furnaces wiping sweat from their faces. Carpenters carved wood slowly beneath shaded roofs while dust gathered around their feet. Craftsmanship required patience. A mistake wasted valuable material. Broken pottery, damaged wood, or ruined cloth could create real hardship for a family trying to survive. Inside weaving workshops, linen thread stretched across large wooden looms. Women and men worked side by side in some places, moving carefully through long hours of repetitive motion. Their fingers became skilled enough to work almost automatically while conversations drifted softly through the room. The clicking of looms created a calm rhythm. Outside, however, the streets burned beneath the afternoon sun. The hottest hours changed the mood of Egypt. Voices became quieter. Movement slowed. Animals searched desperately for shade. Even the wind sometimes disappeared completely, leaving the villages trapped beneath still, heavy air. Inside ordinary homes, afternoon meals remained simple. Bread, onions, beans, dates, or dried fish provided enough strength to continue working. Beer made from grain helped replace water lost through sweat and heat. Many workers ate quickly before returning to labor. There was little time for rest. A young mother might rock a sleeping infant while shaping dough at the same time. A child sorted lentils from pebbles beside the doorway. Another family member repaired fishing nets or sandals worn thin by constant use. Every object inside the home required maintenance. Clay jars cracked. Furniture loosened. Roof coverings wore down beneath sun and wind. Nothing lasted forever in the Egyptian climate. Sometimes desert storms swept across the Nile Valley without much warning. Strong wind carried thick clouds of dust through streets and homes. Families rushed to cover food and close shutters while sand drifted beneath doors and through roof openings. After the storms passed, cleaning began again. Dust covered sleeping mats. Dust filled bowls and baskets. Dust settled over every surface inside the home. The desert always reminded Egypt of its presence. By late afternoon, when sunlight softened into deeper gold, the villages slowly awakened from the stillness of midday heat. Workers returned from fields and workshops with slow, heavy steps. Some carried tools over tired shoulders. Others balanced baskets or bundles gathered during the day. Children waited near the roads watching for parents returning home. The evening hours brought small comforts after long labor. Cooking fires glowed beside doorways while smoke drifted upward into the darkening sky. The smell of roasting fish and fresh bread spread through the streets. Neighbors sat together speaking quietly while cooler air finally moved across the rooftops. Oil lamps flickered softly inside the homes. Their light danced against cracked mud brick walls. Children listened sleepily to the low voices of adults while lying on woven mats. Outside, the Nile moved silently beneath the stars once more. Boats rocked gently against wooden poles. Frogs called from the reeds. The wind carried the smell of water through the warm night air. And throughout Egypt, in villages both small and large, ordinary people rested their tired hands and aching bodies for a few precious hours before dawn slowly returned again to begin another day beside the ancient river. There were some nights when the moonlight over the Nile was so bright that the villages almost seemed awake even after midnight. The rooftops glowed softly beneath pale silver light. Mud brick walls cast long quiet shadows across narrow streets. The river reflected the moon in broken shapes that drifted slowly with the current. Most families slept, though not deeply. The sounds of ancient Egypt continued even during the late hours of darkness. A baby crying somewhere far away. A donkey shifting against its rope. The faint splash of water against tide fishing boats. Wind moving gently through palm leaves. For tired workers resting after long days beneath the sun, these sounds became part of life itself. They blended together night after night until silence no longer felt truly silent. Inside the homes, the air smelled of warm clay, smoke, dust, and sleeping bodies. Linen coverings twisted around tired legs. A cooking bowl forgotten near the fire still carried the scent of lentils and onions. The heat trapped within the walls slowly escaped into the night. Some people woke briefly during the darkest hours simply to breathe cooler air outside. A father climbed quietly onto the roof and sat for a few moments beneath the stars while the village rested around him. His hands still ached from lifting heavy baskets all day in the fields. Nearby, another rooftop held an elderly woman unable to sleep because of pain in her knees and back after a lifetime of labor. She watched the Nile quietly in the moonlight while warm wind moved across the rooftops. Egypt never truly belonged only to the young or the strong. Every village carried tired bodies shaped by years of work. When dawn finally returned, it came slowly once again across the river valley. Pale light touched the tops of the palms first. Then the fields brightened. Then the roads between the homes slowly emerged from darkness. The day began gently. But everyone knew the heat would come soon enough. Inside the homes, morning fires were lit once more. Thin streams of smoke drifted upward through roof openings while women prepared the first bread of the day. Grinding stones moved steadily in dim rooms before sunrise fully arrived. Stone against stone. Back and forth. The sound echoed softly through the villages every morning for countless generations. Some women hummed quietly while they worked, not as performance or entertainment, but simply to accompany the endless repetition of labor. Others remained silent, already tired before the day had fully begun. Nearby, children slowly woke from sleep. A little boy rubbed dust from his eyes before being handed a small task almost immediately. Perhaps he would gather reeds for fuel or help carry tools toward the fields. A young girl folded linen cloths or swept the floor with a reed broom while her mother prepared dough nearby. Childhood in Egypt moved quickly into responsibility. The household depended upon every pair of hands. As the morning light strengthened, village roads became crowded again with workers beginning their daily routines. Farmers headed toward the canals. Fishermen walked to the riverbanks carrying nets across their shoulders. Potters, weavers, scribes, and laborers disappeared into workshops already warming beneath the rising sun. Even the animals followed routines shaped by human labor. Goats were led toward grazing areas. Donkeys carried baskets and jars through dusty streets. Dogs wandered between homes searching for scraps. The villages themselves seemed to wake like living things. Doors opened. Voices rose softly. Cooking smells drifted into the air. In the larger towns along the Nile, bakers worked near glowing ovens from the earliest hours of morning. Bread production never truly stopped. Workers kneaded dough in large clay bowls while sweat formed on their faces from the oven heat. The smell of fresh bread spread through nearby streets. Warm, earthy, comforting after long hungry nights. Bread in Egypt came in many forms. Some loaves were flat and simple. Others were shaped carefully or flavored lightly with dates, herbs, or honey for wealthier households or special occasions. But for ordinary workers, bread remained practical above all else. It filled the stomach. It gave strength for labor. It carried families through difficult seasons. Near the bakeries, beer makers prepared thick grain beer stored in large clay jars. Egyptian beer was not clear like modern drinks. It was heavy and cloudy, filled with grain and nutrients. Workers drank it daily because it provided energy and safer hydration than stagnant water. Large jars lined cool storage rooms. The smell of yeast and grain hung heavily in the air. Outside, the heat continued growing stronger. By late morning, sunlight reflected sharply from stone walls and pale roads. The Nile shimmered beneath the brightness while insects drifted over the reeds. In the farming regions, labor became harder with every passing hour. Men bent low beside irrigation channels clearing mud and weeds with wooden tools. Water moved slowly through narrow canals feeding thirsty crops beneath the hot sky. Oxen pulled plows through damp earth while birds circled overhead. Sweat darkened linen clothing almost immediately. Bare feet pressed into warm mud. Muscles burned from repetition. Still, there were moments of beauty hidden quietly inside the work. The sight of sunlight moving across green fields beside the river. The cool feeling of wet soil during irrigation. Birdsong drifting across the canals in the early hours before the heat became too intense. Egyptian life was difficult, but the land itself often remained beautiful in calm and simple ways. Inside the villages, women continued their endless cycle of household chores. Some repaired torn clothing using bone needles and linen thread. Others crushed herbs with stone tools for cooking or medicine. Clay jars needed checking. Floors needed sweeping again after dust blew inside. A woman might spend hours preparing a single meal. Fuel for fires had to be gathered carefully because wood was scarce in many regions. Animal dung dried beneath the sun was often burned for cooking instead. The smell lingered in the streets and courtyards, mixing with smoke and dust beneath the warm air. Near the riverbanks, laundry flapped gently in the breeze after washing. Linen garments dried quickly beneath the Egyptian sun. Children chased each other nearby while mothers worked, though the games usually ended quickly once another chore appeared. Nothing remained still for long. The day kept moving. The labor kept returning. At midday, many homes became dim and quiet as families escaped indoors from the worst heat. Thick mud brick walls blocked some of the sunlight, creating cooler shadows where people rested briefly. An old man slept sitting upright beside a storage jar. A mother closed her eyes for a few moments while a baby rested beside her. Outside, the streets shimmered beneath white sunlight almost too bright to look at. Even the animals grew quiet during these hours. Goats rested in narrow shade. Birds disappeared into palms and reeds. Dogs stretched motionless beneath carts. The afternoon carried a strange sleepy stillness across Egypt. Then eventually, the fierce brightness began softening again. Shadows slowly returned to the roads. Wind moved once more through the village streets. Workers lifted tired bodies and finished the final tasks of the day. At the riverbanks, fishermen returned with their catch while children waited nearby hoping to help clean the fish. Farmers washed dirt from their hands and feet in shallow water before heading home. The smell of evening fires soon filled the air. Smoke drifted upward in soft gray lines. Clay pots simmered over glowing coals. Families gathered together again inside small warm homes where oil lamps flickered against cracked walls. The evening meal was one of the few moments when work briefly slowed. Bread passed from hand to hand. Beer filled simple cups. Voices remained low and tired after the long heat of the day. Sometimes stories were told softly during these hours. An older relative spoke about flood seasons from many years ago or remembered a difficult harvest survived long ago beside the Nile. Children listened sleepily while leaning against their parents. Outside, darkness settled slowly across the villages. The stars returned above Egypt once more. The Nile reflected moonlight beside the reeds. And in countless mud brick homes warmed by cooking fires and crowded with tired families, ordinary people closed their eyes again while the ancient river continued flowing endlessly through the quiet night. When the flood season arrived along the Nile, the entire rhythm of Egyptian life changed. The river rose slowly at first. Water crept over the edges of canals and spread quietly across the lower fields. Farmers stood watching the changes carefully beneath the hot sky. They understood that the flood carried both danger and survival together. Without the flooding, the soil would grow weak and dry. With too much water, homes and storage areas could be damaged. Everything depended upon balance. As the days passed, wide areas beside the Nile disappeared beneath shining water. The river seemed larger and slower then, stretching across the valley beneath pale sunlight. Boats moved through places where people had once walked. Palm trees reflected in the flood water beside half-covered roads and walls. Children often stared quietly at the changing landscape. The world looked different during flood season. The air smelled of wet earth and river mud. Frogs became louder at night. Insects gathered thickly near the water. For farmers, this season sometimes brought temporary relief from the hardest field labor because planting could not begin until the waters withdrew again. But rest did not truly exist. There were always repairs to make, tools to fix, walls to strengthen, boats to clean, or government labor projects demanding workers. Many men spent flood season hauling stone or helping build canals, temples, and storehouses. Their hands remained rough and tired no matter the season. Inside the villages, homes near lower ground had to be watched carefully. Water seeped into foundations made from mud brick. Floors became damp. Families lifted baskets and supplies higher against the walls to protect them from moisture. The smell inside the homes changed too. Wet clay. River mud drying slowly. Smoke from fires struggling against damp air. Women worked constantly to keep food stores safe during these months. Grain could spoil if moisture entered storage jars. Mold and insects became dangerous enemies hidden quietly inside the dark corners of the home. Nothing could be neglected for long. The flood season reminded people how fragile ordinary life could be. At night, the sound of water filled the darkness around the villages. The Nile moved heavily beyond the homes while reeds bent gently in the warm wind. Families sleeping on rooftops listened to frogs, insects, and distant splashing from boats traveling through flooded areas beneath moonlight. Some nights felt strangely peaceful during the season. The air cooled slightly from the water. The fields reflected the stars. Wind drifted softly across the flooded valley. And still, every morning the chores returned. Women rose before dawn to grind grain while the village remained dark and quiet. The steady sound of stone grinding echoed once more through the homes. Bread dough was prepared. Fires were rebuilt. Children slowly woke beside walls still cool from the night air. Even during flood season, daily life never stopped moving. Fishermen often thrived during these months because the wider waters brought abundant fish into new areas. Boats drifted quietly through flooded fields where fish swam among submerged plants. Nets disappeared beneath calm brown water. Birds gathered in enormous numbers along the riverbanks. The fishermen worked carefully and patiently beneath soft morning light while mist floated above the flood waters. For some families, these were good months for food. Fresh fish roasted over cooking fires in the evenings while children sat nearby watching hungrily. The smell filled the narrow village streets as darkness slowly settled over the Nile. But flood season also carried sickness. Standing water allowed insects to multiply. Fevers spread more easily through crowded homes. Mosquitoes drifted through roof openings during the night. Children scratched swollen bites while trying to sleep in the heat. Doctors and healers mixed herbs, oils, and medicines in quiet rooms lit by oil lamps. Prayers were whispered beside sleeping mats. Mothers pressed cool cloth against the foreheads of feverish children while listening anxiously to their breathing. The ancient world could feel very uncertain during illness. There were no guarantees. Only hope, patience, and endurance. In larger towns, flood season transformed the marketplaces too. Boats replaced some roads for moving goods. Merchants unloaded grain, pottery, fish, and linen directly onto river docks crowded with workers carrying baskets through the mud. The smells became even stronger then. Wet reeds, fish scales, sweat, river water baking beneath the sun. Voices echoed across the crowded docks while laborers balanced heavy loads on tired shoulders. Every part of Egypt depended upon movement and carrying. Workers carried water, carried grain, carried stone, carried wood, carried baskets of fish or clay jars through heat and dust from sunrise until darkness. The body itself became the engine of survival. Inside ordinary homes, flood season often meant families spent more time together indoors during certain hours. Children sat beside parents weaving baskets or repairing nets. Older relatives told stories while rain clouds occasionally drifted across the distant sky. Rain itself was uncommon in much of Egypt, but when it arrived, people noticed immediately. The smell of wet dust rose into the air. Drops struck rooftops softly. Children sometimes ran outside laughing beneath the rare cool water. Then the dry heat usually returned soon afterward. In wealthier homes, flood season brought different concerns. Servants checked storehouses carefully for moisture damage. Officials recorded grain supplies and monitored canal conditions. Scribes worked long hours writing reports while trying to keep papyrus dry in the damp air. Yet even wealthy households could not fully escape the discomfort of the season. Mosquitoes entered every home. Mud gathered along roads and courtyards. The smell of damp river air spread everywhere. As the flood waters slowly began retreating weeks later, the land emerged once again from beneath the river. Thick dark mud remained across the fields, rich and fertile beneath the warm sun. Then another demanding cycle began. Farmers returned to the land carrying tools over their shoulders while birds followed behind searching for insects in the fresh soil. Planting season required careful timing and exhausting labor. Seeds were pressed into damp earth by hand. Canals needed repairing after flood damage. Oxen pulled plows slowly through the heavy mud. Feet sank deeply with every step. The work covered bodies in dirt from morning until evening. Still, there was quiet hope during these days too. Fresh soil meant possible harvests. Harvests meant bread. Bread meant survival through another year beside the Nile. Inside the villages, women prepared larger meals when supplies allowed, trying to strengthen exhausted workers during planting season. Lentils simmered in clay pots while fresh bread cooled beside cooking fires. Children carried water into the fields where fathers and older brothers worked beneath the hot sun. Even very young children understood the importance of the planting season. The entire household depended upon it. By evening, tired workers returned home with mud dried across their legs and hands. They washed beside water jars or in the river while the sunlight faded into soft gold over the fields. The villages smelled of wet soil and smoke. Birds crossed the sky heading toward the reeds. Cooking fires glowed one by one in the growing darkness. Families gathered closely inside their homes while oil lamps flickered softly against the walls. Outside, frogs called from remaining pools left behind by the flood waters. Children fell asleep quickly after long days helping with chores. Parents spoke quietly about crops, weather, and canal repairs while stretching aching muscles near the warmth of the fire. Above them, the stars slowly filled the Egyptian sky once more. And beside the ancient Nile, whose waters had shaped every part of their lives, ordinary people rested quietly for another night while the river continued its endless journey through the dark and fertile land. When the planting season settled fully across the Nile Valley, the villages became busier than ever. Before sunrise each morning, workers were already moving through the dim light carrying baskets of seed, wooden tools, and jars of water. The flood waters had withdrawn, leaving behind dark fertile soil that stretched beside the river like rich black cloth beneath the pale dawn sky. The earth felt soft beneath bare feet. Cool at first. Then warmer as the sun slowly climbed higher. Farmers walked quietly toward the fields while mist hovered low above the canals. Some carried small children on their shoulders for part of the journey before setting them down near the work areas. Entire families often labored together during these important weeks. The fields could not wait. Seeds had to enter the soil at the proper time. The rhythm of Egypt depended upon it. Birds gathered everywhere during planting season. They circled over the freshly turned earth searching for grain scattered by workers. Children spent long hours chasing them away, waving sticks and shouting into the warm air. Their voices echoed softly across the open land. Nearby, oxen pulled wooden plows through the mud while farmers guided them carefully. The animals moved slowly beneath the growing heat, their bodies dark with sweat and river water. Wooden harnesses creaked. Mud clung heavily to legs and sandals. The work demanded patience more than speed. Every row mattered. Every handful of seed carried hope for the future. By mid-morning, sunlight already burned brightly across the valley. The coolness of dawn disappeared quickly in Egypt. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads and necks while sweat rolled down their arms and backs. Water jars became precious beneath the rising heat. Families rested briefly beside canals to drink and wash dust from their faces. Some sat quietly chewing bread and onions while staring across the fields in tired silence. The planting season exhausted everyone. Yet it also brought a feeling of renewal. After the floodwaters and uncertainty, green life would soon begin rising again from the soil. Inside the villages, women who remained at home worked just as hard as those in the fields. Grain still needed grinding. Bread still needed baking. Laundry gathered in woven baskets beside the walls. Children too young for field labor needed watching through the long hot hours. A woman might spend the morning carrying water from the Nile, then preparing food for workers returning briefly at midday before beginning repairs on damaged clothing or weaving mats from reeds. There was always another task waiting. Always another small responsibility inside the home. The mud brick walls held the sounds of this daily labor. Grinding stones scraping steadily. Clay bowls knocking softly together. The crackling of cooking fires. The sleepy breathing of infants resting in shaded corners. Homes in ancient Egypt were rarely quiet during daylight hours. Even small spaces contained constant movement. Several generations often lived together beneath one roof, especially among poorer families. Grandparents rested near doorways where the breeze moved slightly better. Children slept on mats beside storage jars. Cooking supplies shared space with tools, baskets, and woven linen. Privacy hardly existed. Life unfolded openly and closely around everyone. In larger towns, workshops also became crowded during planting season because tools constantly required repair. Farmers arrived carrying broken handles, dull blades, damaged baskets, and cracked storage jars. Carpenters shaped new wooden parts beneath shaded roofs while sweat dripped steadily from their faces. Potters worked beside spinning wheels forming fresh jars from Nile clay. The smell of wet earth filled their workshops. Nearby, blacksmiths hammered glowing metal while sparks jumped into the hot air. The sounds blended together into the living heartbeat of Egypt. Hammering. Voices. Animals. Footsteps. The turning of wheels. The scrape of sandals against dust-covered roads. Markets remained busy too during these weeks. Merchants sold food, tools, cloth, fish, oil, and countless small necessities required by working families. Donkeys pushed through crowded streets carrying heavy loads balanced carefully along their sides. Flies gathered thickly over baskets of dates and fish drying beneath the sun. Merchants wiped sweat from their necks while calling softly to passing customers. Children wandered beside parents carrying small bundles or clay cups. The smell of the markets changed hour by hour. Fresh bread in the morning. Hot dust and animals by midday. Smoke and cooked food toward evening. For scribes and officials, planting season brought endless counting and recording. Grain supplies needed measuring. Labor assignments had to be tracked carefully. Canal conditions were inspected. Taxes connected to harvests were calculated long before crops fully grew. Scribes sat cross-legged inside shaded rooms with papyrus spread before them. Reed brushes moved carefully through dark ink while sunlight glowed against pale walls. Though their work spared them some physical hardship, long hours bent over writing still exhausted the body. Eyes strained in dim light. Hands cramped from repetition. Heat filled even the quietest rooms. No one truly escaped the climate of Egypt. As afternoon settled across the land, the sunlight became thick and blinding once more. Workers in the fields slowed their movements beneath the crushing heat. Some covered their faces with linen cloth to protect against blowing dust and harsh sunlight reflecting from the wet soil. The canals shimmered beneath the bright sky. Dragonflies hovered above the water. Birdsong faded during the hottest hours. Back inside the villages, homes became dim places of temporary shelter from the heat outside. Mud brick walls trapped some coolness from the night before. Families rested quietly when possible. An old woman slowly repaired a torn basket near the doorway. A child slept with one arm wrapped around a clay jar cooled by damp cloth. A mother sat silently for a few moments beside the wall before rising again for more chores. Even rest itself remained brief. Soon enough, another fire needed tending. Another meal needed preparing. Another jar needed filling from the river. Toward late afternoon, the light finally softened over the Nile Valley. Workers in the fields straightened aching backs and gathered tools while long shadows stretched across the earth. The smell of damp soil rose into the cooling air. Farmers washed mud from their feet beside irrigation canals before beginning the slow walk home. Children carried smaller baskets behind them while trying to keep pace with the adults. The return journey often happened in silence. People were simply too tired to speak much after such long days. Back inside the villages, evening fires already glowed beside many homes. Smoke drifted upward into orange skies while women stirred lentils and vegetables inside clay pots. Fresh bread cooled on woven mats. Fish roasted slowly over glowing coals. The smell spread warmly through the narrow streets. Even exhausted workers felt comfort returning at the sight of evening meals waiting after the day's labor. Families gathered together beneath fading light while oil lamps flickered softly nearby. Hands roughened by work tore bread apart slowly. Children leaned sleepily against parents or grandparents. Voices stayed low and calm. Outside, the Nile reflected the colors of sunset in long shimmering patterns between the reeds. Boats drifted quietly toward shore while birds disappeared into the gathering darkness. Then night slowly settled over Egypt once more. The heat faded little by little from the walls and roads. Stars appeared above the river valley. And inside thousands of simple homes built from mud, straw, and human effort beside the ancient Nile, ordinary people closed their tired eyes again, preparing their bodies for another sunrise and another day shaped by work, dust, water, bread, and the endless gentle rhythm of life in ancient Egypt. Some mornings arrived with complete stillness over the Nile Valley. No wind moved through the palm trees. No ripples crossed the shallow edges of the river. The air itself felt heavy even before sunrise, carrying the promise of another long hot day across the fields and villages of Egypt. Inside the homes, people woke slowly in the thick warmth. A child pushed aside a linen covering damp from sleep. An old man sat quietly for a moment before standing, waiting for stiffness to leave his knees. Nearby, someone carefully poured yesterday's remaining water into a clay cup while trying not to wake the rest of the household too early. The day always began gently at first. Then labor slowly filled every hour. In one small home near the riverbanks, a woman knelt beside the grinding stone while pale morning light entered through a narrow opening high in the wall. Flour dust settled softly onto her arms as she pushed the heavy stone back and forth with practiced rhythm. The sound blended with the waking village outside. Doors opening. Donkeys shifting. Voices murmuring in the distance. Soon the smell of smoke drifted into the room as cooking fires came alive again across the settlement. Tiny sparks floated upward beneath dark ceilings stained by years of smoke and heat. Bread dough rested nearby beneath cloth. Children still slept in the corner. A basket of onions leaned against the wall beside stacked jars of grain. The home was simple, crowded, and worn by time, yet it held everything the family needed to survive another day. For ordinary Egyptians, survival itself depended upon routine. The same chores repeated endlessly because they could not be ignored. Water spoiled. Bread grew stale. Clothing tore. Dust gathered. Animals needed feeding. Canals required maintenance. There was comfort inside repetition, but also exhaustion. Along the Nile, fishermen stepped into their boats before the sunlight grew too harsh. Wooden hulls creaked softly against muddy banks while birds drifted low across the water searching for movement beneath the surface. The river smelled alive in the early morning. Wet reeds. Mud. Fish. Cool water warming beneath the rising sun. Some fishermen worked with family members beside them. Fathers taught sons how to throw nets properly or read changes in the current. Younger boys untangled ropes while older men watched the water carefully for signs of fish movement. Patience was part of every Egyptian trade. Nothing happened quickly beside the Nile. In farming villages farther inland from the river banks, workers were already crossing damp fields toward irrigation canals by sunrise. Their sandals darkened with mud almost immediately. Oxen snorted softly while pulling wooden plows through the rich soil left behind after flood season. The fields stretched green and gold beneath the brightening sky. For a few moments in early morning, before the heat became difficult, the land looked peaceful. Birds sang from the reeds. Canal water reflected pale sunlight. Fresh plants moved gently in the breeze. Then the labor began fully. Men bent over crops hour after hour pulling weeds or repairing damaged canal walls. Women carried baskets of seed or food between work areas while balancing jars of water carefully against their hips. Children helped wherever they could. No one remained idle for long. Even elderly people unable to perform heavy labor still repaired tools, watched younger children, or sorted grain beneath shaded doorways. Inside the larger towns, merchants prepared for another busy day in the markets. They arranged pottery, fish, vegetables, linen cloth, sandals, oils, and baskets beneath shaded awnings while trying to finish before the strongest sunlight arrived. The market road slowly filled with movement. Donkeys carrying heavy loads. Workers searching for tools or food. Women comparing prices while children followed closely behind. The smell of baking bread drifted between crowded stalls. Flies buzzed lazily above fish laid out for sale. Some merchants called softly to passing customers, though few wasted energy shouting loudly beneath the growing heat. Most people in Egypt learned early to save strength whenever possible. The climate demanded it. As morning turned toward midday, the sun rose higher over the valley until pale walls and roads almost glowed beneath the brightness. Heat pressed against the villages like a heavy blanket. Inside workshops, conditions became difficult. Potters sweated beside burning kilns. Metal workers stood before furnaces hotter than the air outside. Weavers sat bent over looms while flies drifted through the warm rooms. The smell of heated clay, smoke, and sweat filled the streets. Still, the work continued steadily. A potter shaped wet clay carefully between rough hands, forming jars that would later store grain, beer, oil, or water inside Egyptian homes. Nearby, another worker painted simple designs onto bowls while trying to ignore the heat collecting beneath the roof. Nothing in Egypt lasted forever without maintenance. Clay cracked. Wood dried and split. Reeds became brittle beneath the sun. Every household depended upon craftsmen whose labor quietly supported daily life. Back inside the homes, midday meals were being prepared slowly despite the heat. Women stirred lentils in clay pots while wiping sweat from their necks with linen cloth. Bread baked earlier in the morning rested beneath woven covers beside bowls of dates or onions. Cooking itself became exhausting during the hottest hours. Fires filled the rooms with smoke and warmth. Children grew restless and tired. Even simple tasks felt heavier beneath the afternoon sun. Some families ate quietly in shaded courtyards if they had them. Poorer households often sat near doorways where slight movement of air offered small relief. Meals remained simple for most people. Bread, beans, beer, fish when available. Sometimes figs or dates during good seasons. Yet even small meals carried comfort after long labor. For a few moments, work slowed while families gathered together. Outside, however, the heat remained relentless. Dust rose beneath every passing footstep. Dogs searched for narrow strips of shade beside walls. The canals shimmered brightly beneath the white sky. In the fields, workers wrapped cloth around their heads and continued despite exhaustion. Harvests could not wait simply because the body felt weak or overheated. Egypt's survival depended upon steady labor through every season. A farmer paused briefly beside an irrigation canal and splashed water across his face before returning to work. Mud covered his legs to the knees. His shoulders burned from sunlight after years beneath the open sky. Still, somewhere nearby, green crops moved gently in the warm wind. The Nile continued flowing steadily beside the land. Life carried on. Toward evening, relief slowly returned to the villages. Shadows stretched across roads and rooftops while the sunlight softened from harsh white into deep gold. The entire mood of Egypt changed during these hours. Voices grew calmer. People moved more slowly now from exhaustion rather than urgency. Children reappeared in the streets after hiding indoors from the worst heat. At the riverbanks, fishermen returned with baskets of fresh catch while women washed dust from clothing beside the water. Birds crossed low over the reeds searching for places to rest before nightfall. The smell of evening fires drifted across the villages. Smoke rose softly into the orange sky. Inside the homes, oil lamps were prepared while cooking pots simmered over glowing coals. Families gathered once more for the final meal of the day. Some evenings carried quiet conversation. Others carried only tired silence. An old grandmother told stories softly while children listened with heavy eyes. A father repaired a broken sandal strap near the doorway while watching the last sunlight fade from the rooftops. Outside, darkness slowly covered the Nile Valley. The stars returned one by one above the river. Warm wind moved through the palms. And inside the mud brick homes lining the ancient roads of Egypt, ordinary people settled down once again beside sleeping children, cooling walls, and fading cooking fires, resting their weary bodies before another dawn arrived over the Nile. The night beside the Nile grows quieter now. The cooking fires have faded into soft red embers. The last voices in the village have become whispers behind mud brick walls. Somewhere near the riverbanks, water moves slowly through the reeds beneath the silver light of the moon. The long day is finally over. Farmers rest their tired hands after working the dark soil beside the canals. Fishermen sleep beside folded nets still carrying the scent of river water. Mothers lie beside sleeping children while warm night air drifts gently through the small homes. Above the rooftops of Egypt, the stars shine calmly across the endless sky. The same stars watched over these villages thousands of years ago. They watched over the quiet courtyards, the dusty roads, the baskets of grain, the glowing oil lamps, and the countless ordinary people whose lives passed softly beside the river. Most of their names are forgotten now. But their days were real. The sound of sandals against stone floors. The smell of fresh bread rising before sunrise. The ache of tired muscles at the end of a long afternoon beneath the heat. The cool relief of evening wind moving across rooftop beds. These small moments filled the ancient world far more than kings or monuments ever could. And now, little by little, the villages grow still beneath the dark sky. The boats rest quietly along the shore. The palm leaves sway softly in the warm breeze. The Nile continues its slow endless journey through the sleeping land. Inside the homes, breathing becomes deeper and slower. Children dream beneath linen blankets. Oil lamps flicker one final time before darkness gently settles into every room. And far above the silent river valley, beneath the peaceful stars of ancient Egypt, the ancient world slowly drifts into sleep.